And indeed, imagine the outside pressures that would be brought to bear from organized interests. I guess it comes down to this, really. Our current Congress is widely thought to be deadlocked and hopelessly divided when it comes to taking actions and exercising its legislative power. And when Congress does take action, many folks understandably regard its actions as the product more of powerful lobbyists than reflecting a notion of the public interest. So why should we expect a convention of the states to be any different from Congress? Indeed, it's more likely, considering the higher stakes, to even be more a target of these organized pressures and lobbying groups than the pressures attending ordinary legislation. And there's another concern, too. That brings me to my second concern about people who say, well, a convention, runaway convention, we could do worse. As much as we lionize the framers, they themselves were hardly representative of the people. They were all white men. I have nothing against white men. Most of them had land or money, or both. Many of them were relatively old. They were all Christian of one stripe or another. Many of them were lawyers. There were many groups that weren't at the table in Philadelphia in 1787. And that shows up in various provisions in the Constitution, such as those that perpetuated slavery and that ultimately required a civil war to resolve. Even so, we can accept the idea that, generally speaking, the framers did very well under the circumstances, if we're to judge by the results of our comparatively stable, prosperous country. As I've suggested, however, the circumstances that obtained back then differed greatly from those that would apply today. Now, as I wrap up my discussion of the amendment process, and before I turn to the specific proposed concurrent resolution in Idaho, I wanted to acknowledge that many of the things that are of concern about the convention process are fears of unknowns. We worry not only about what might happen about a constitutional convention, how it would work and what would happen during it, but we also worry about what could come out of it. There are a lot of unknowns, but there is one thing that is absolutely, positively, without a doubt going to happen. Lawsuits. Lots and lots and lots of lawsuits. Now again, I'm not against lawsuits. If I said anything against lawsuits, I might get fired from my job at the law school. But they could indefinitely prolong the process and frankly be a significant financial drain on all concerned. So to the extent we can confidently predict one result of the convention process, that alone is a reason to be worried. Now let me turn to the Idaho proposed concurrent resolution. Now the resolution is, I'm going to give you some information about it. I commend to everybody who's interested in this topic to read the full version. It's not actually incredibly long. But specifically, this proposed concurrent resolution calls for a constitutional convention, or actually, I guess, calls on Congress to call a convention of the states to consider amendments that, quote, impose fiscal restraints on the federal government, and amendments that limit the power and jurisdiction of the federal government, end quote. The resolution also provides for the selection of 7 delegates plus 3 alternates who would attend the Convention of the States representing Idaho. Although the resolution is a bit unclear, as I mentioned, it appears that a majority of the delegates and alternates can be current members of the Idaho legislature. The proposed concurrent resolution also contains provisions designed to ensure that the delegates stay within their powers when it comes to advocating only for proposed amendments of the sort I previously described relating to putting fiscal constraints on the federal government and limiting its power and jurisdiction. Now, the proposed concurrent resolution starts out with a set of whereas clauses that are meant to justify this resolution. Let me just read a couple of them that I think are particularly interesting. Whereas the founders of the United States Constitution empowered state legislators to be guardians of liberty against excessive use of power by the federal government. And whereas the federal government has created a crushing national debt through improper and imprudent spending, and whereas the federal government has ceased to operate under a proper interpretation of the United States Constitution and invaded the legitimate roles of the states, etc., etc., it's the solemn duty of the state of Idaho to call for a convention. I'd make a couple of observations about this resolution. So one of the central justifications is that the federal government as a whole is acting beyond the powers granted to it under the U.S. Constitution. Well, if the federal government is already acting beyond constitutional limits, that problem is not going to be solved by adding additional constitutional limits. If the federal government is not obeying existing limits, how can adding more limits make any difference? It won't presumably obey them either. I think the solution, and I believe that League of Women Voters is very much on point here, is electing, is exercising their right to vote and electing people who will obey what voters regard as the proper limits and role of the federal government. And the other thing about the concurrent resolution that causes me concern is that the description of the constitutional amendments that Idaho wants a convention to consider is extremely nebulous. What does fiscal constraints mean? And I'm more concerned, what do limits on the power and jurisdiction of the federal government mean? On that latter point, I can hazard a guess. Many folks who believe the federal government acts outside its constitutional power target the expansive interpretation that the U.S. Supreme Court has given specifically to Congress's power to regulate interstate commerce. And that power is indeed the basis for a great deal of modern federal legislation, including all of the environmental protection laws, all of the laws that ban discrimination in the private sector, like the workplace and in privately owned places of public accommodation. If Congress's power to regulate commerce were reduced, we would see many laws that enjoy significant public support and that we take as kind of keystones of our modern system would fall by the wayside. And I'm talking about laws such as the Endangered Species Act, the Clean Water Act, Title VII, and Title IV of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Now, even if you think that these laws exceed Congress's power under the current Constitution, throwing the validity of these cornerstone laws into doubt through the process of the Convention of the States could produce really, really significant public unrest, especially when you recall, again, that the constitutional amendments could be ratified by states that don't represent the majority of the population. So to sum it up, I think that there are severe adverse risks of social and economic instability associated with calling a convention of the states. And that's even assuming the convention doesn't accomplish anything. That would probably be the most we could hope for. And of course, to the extent that it does produce results, we have reason to worry that they would not necessarily promote the public interest. So that's why I think, indeed, people across the ideological spectrum think there are good reasons to fear a convention of the states. Now, that concludes my prepared remarks, and I would love to open it up for your questions and just a general discussion at this point.
Wouldn't the proposed, like taking Idaho's proposed resolution, doesn't the argument for reduced federal overreach in a way contradict the original purpose of the Constitution Convention? Because as we recall, the Articles of Convention had a very weak federal government, and that was not working out, which is why they called the Constitution. So it seems by acting in the name of the Constitution, they're wanting to go against the original intent while claiming to be for the original intent.
Yeah, I mean, certainly the whole point, or one of the central ideas behind the framing of the Constitution was to create a more perfect union, meaning a set of states, groups of people that stuck together better for purposes of things like national defense and raising taxes for infrastructure and things like that. It's interesting. There continues to be debate about the very nature of the U.S. Constitution. It's clear that the Articles of Confederation was meant to be in the nature of a treaty, really, with the states kind of almost operating as foreign governments that came together to form a treaty. Many people would say that the U.S. Constitution actually preserved that idea of really a confederation. Now, there are lots of reasons to doubt that characterization, including the words of the preamble of the Constitution, we the people, and also just the process by which it was adopted. But the proponents would say the federal government has gone too far. If there was a reason for a stronger central government than existed, but this has gotten out of hand.